The night was quiet, yet a tension hung in the air as paramedics carefully maneuvered the stretcher through the dimly lit hallway. The victim, a young adult male, had been found under circumstances that immediately suggested foul play. Outside, police lights flickered across the street, casting blue and red reflections against the surrounding walls. Investigators were already piecing together fragments of a timeline, neighbors reporting sounds, vehicles observed near the location, and digital timestamps from nearby security cameras. Each tiny detail would later become a critical puzzle piece, but at this moment, the primary focus rested on the body, which silently held answers that human witnesses could not articulate. Inside the forensic lab, the body was transferred to a cold metal table. Overhead, bright white lights illuminated every angle, shadows falling sharply against the tiled walls. The forensic team, composed of pathologists, technicians, and assistants, prepared instruments, swabs, and cameras to meticulously document every observation. In these first moments, the groundwork was laid for the autopsy, the silent testimony that would reveal both the mechanism of death and the sequence of events leading to it. As the body was positioned, the pathologist began the visual examination. The skin, hair, and clothing were assessed for marks, bruising, or abnormalities. Even minor abrasions could reveal a struggle, defensive wounds, or indicators of restraint. One of the first notable observations was the presence of contusions on the forearms. These injuries suggested the victim may have attempted to shield himself or fight back against an assailant. The bruising pattern was meticulously documented with photographs and measurements, providing an objective record that could later be compared to witness accounts or suspect statements. Each mark was analyzed for age, depth, and potential cause, helping establish the timeline of the assault. The pathologist made note of the skin's condition, the presence of rigor mortis, liver patterns, and early signs of decomposition, all indicated an estimated postmortem interval. These biological clocks, though subtle, provide one of the most reliable methods to narrow down the time of death. Attention then turned to the clothing. Fibers were collected for analysis, and tears or bloodstains were mapped. One bloodstain pattern on the shirt sleeve suggested contact during a scuffle, while another indicated a point of origin consistent with a sharp force injury. In forensic analysis, the placement, direction, and spatter pattern of blood is as informative as the injury itself, often confirming or contradicting narratives provided by witnesses. Every sample was preserved, labeled, and photographed. Trace evidence, such as soil, hairs, or microscopic fibers, was also collected from the clothing. Each seemingly inconsequential fragment could later tie the victim to a location, an object, or even the assailant. Moving toward internal examination, the forensic team prepared to investigate the victim's body cavity, a procedure designed to identify trauma that is not visible externally. The first incision is deliberate and systematic, ensuring that the body can later be reconstructed for documentation or courtroom presentation. As organs were exposed, each was inspected for lacerations, hemorrhaging, or other trauma. One of the first critical findings was extensive hemorrhaging in the chest cavity, consistent with a penetrating injury that likely caused rapid death. The pathologist carefully measured the wound track, noting its direction, depth, and possible trajectory. These details not only reveal the immediate cause of death, but can also indicate the position of the victim and assailant during the attack, adding a spatial dimension to the investigation. In the background, technicians prepared samples for toxicology testing. Blood and tissue samples were collected to detect substances that could have contributed to death or impaired the victim's ability to defend himself. Toxicology is often crucial in distinguishing between intentional homicide, accidental death, or drug-facilitated incidents. In this case, preliminary examination suggested no immediate chemical influence, focusing the investigation squarely on the physical trauma. Throughout this meticulous process, the autopsy report begins to take shape. Every observation, every measurement, and every sample is translated into documentation, forming a narrative dictated entirely by the victim's body. Unlike witness statements, the body does not lie or omit details. It records, silently, the sequence of events, the forces applied, and the body's responses. The first part of the narrative, the external and initial internal examination, forms the foundation for understanding how the crime unfolded. Once the external examination was complete, the pathologist focused on defining the exact mechanism of death. This involves translating injuries into physiological consequences. The penetrating chest injury observed in the first phase was confirmed to have punctured the left lung and heart, causing rapid internal bleeding and cardiac failure. Measurements were precise. Depth, width, and angle of penetration were all documented. Even minute details like the shape of the wound edge could later identify the weapon used. A pathologist can often match a wound to a specific type of knife, blade, or firearm caliber. In this case, the wound characteristics indicated a sharp-edged instrument rather than a blunt object or projectile. The forensic team then conducted a full skeletal examination. Subtle fractures in the ribs indicated defensive reactions. The victim had instinctively raised arms to protect vital organs. These fractures provide insight into the struggle, confirming that the victim did not passively succumb, but actively resisted the assailant. Even minor microfractures can be crucial in reconstructing the dynamics of the crime scene. A slight shift in body position, recorded by contusions and fractures, allows investigators to understand whether the victim was standing, crouching, or lying during the attack. The internal examination also revealed other injuries that contributed to a fuller understanding of the assault. Abrasions on the scalp suggested impact, potentially from a struggle with another individual or an object. Hematomas in the neck region suggested manual compression or a secondary defensive injury. Each injury was meticulously measured, photographed, and correlated with external evidence. These details allowed the reconstruction of a timeline, the sequence of blows, the moment of incapacitation, and the point at which the fatal injury occurred. At the same time, microscopic samples were prepared for histological analysis. Tissue sections were stained and examined under high-powered microscopes, revealing cellular responses to trauma. These responses help determine whether injuries occurred before death, during the process of dying, or post-mortem. For instance, hemorrhage surrounding a wound indicates circulation at the time of trauma, while the absence of such evidence may suggest post-mortem injury. In this case, histology confirmed that all significant injuries occurred while the victim was alive, solidifying the classification of the incident as homicide. The autopsy also included a detailed examination of the victim's extremities. Fingernail clippings were preserved to detect trace DNA from the assailant. The skin beneath the nails was examined for tearing or bruising consistent with defensive actions. These minor details are often pivotal in cases where suspects are later interrogated, offering a tangible link between victim and perpetrator. Hair samples, both head and body, were analyzed for foreign DNA or toxic substances, providing a multi-layered approach to uncovering hidden details of the assault. Blood pattern analysis within the body, along with external spatter, allowed investigators to reconstruct the orientation and movements of the victim during the attack. The trajectory of each wound, combined with clotting and flow patterns, established whether the victim was stationary, moving, or forced into a specific position. In complex homicides, such detailed biomechanical reconstruction is essential for accurately portraying the events, both in investigative reports and in court presentations. By the end of this phase, the autopsy report not only contained the cause and mechanism of death, but also painted a vivid narrative of the attack. It identified the weapon type, sequence of injuries, signs of resistance, and physical state of the victim throughout the incident. This silent testimony, meticulously recorded, offered a factual counterpoint to conflicting witness accounts, rumors, or initial speculation at the crime scene. After the internal examination and preliminary observations were complete, the focus shifted to toxicology, trace evidence, and the more subtle markers that often reveal hidden details about a homicide. In the forensic lab, technicians carefully prepared blood, urine, and tissue samples for analysis. These biological specimens, though silent, held crucial data about the victim's physiological state at the time of death, potential exposure to substances, and the circumstances leading up to the crime. Even the smallest traces of alcohol, prescription medication, or illicit drugs can dramatically alter the interpretation of events, either confirming or refuting initial theories. In this case, every sample was logged, double-checked, and processed under rigorous chain-of-custody protocols to ensure the evidence remained untarnished. The first major finding in toxicology revealed no indication of intoxicants or substances that could impair the victim's motor skills or judgment. This immediately eliminated hypotheses of accidental injury due to negligence, substance-induced disorientation, or drug-facilitated assault. The victim had faced the attack fully conscious and physically capable, which reinforced earlier observations of defensive injuries and the struggle noted in the bruising patterns on the arms and torso. This clarity allowed investigators to narrow the focus on human agency and intentional actions rather than accidental or environmental factors. DNA analysis became the next pivotal step. Samples collected from under the victim's fingernails, hair, and clothing were meticulously processed to detect foreign genetic material. Even microscopic traces could point to the presence of an assailant or secondary individuals involved in the crime. Forensic specialists used advanced amplification techniques to extract usable DNA from minuscule amounts, generating profiles that could later be matched against databases or suspects. In this case, the fingernail swabs revealed partial foreign DNA, confirming that the victim had indeed engaged physically with another individual during the struggle. This small but critical detail provided a concrete link between the crime scene and the perpetrator. Simultaneously, trace evidence from the clothing and body surfaces underwent detailed analysis. Fibers, soil particles, and microscopic debris were examined to determine origin and potential association with the environment where the attack occurred. For instance, soil caught in clothing seams was matched with samples collected from the location where the body was discovered, confirming the site as the primary scene of the assault. Hair fibers found on the victim's jacket were analyzed under comparison microscopes, revealing matches with other evidence collected from nearby surfaces. Each fragment of trace evidence, though invisible to the casual observer, formed part of a tangible, verifiable narrative that described the events leading to death with remarkable precision. As the forensic team consolidated these findings, the crime reconstruction process began. Using all the collected data, injury patterns, blood spatter analysis, DNA evidence, and trace elements, investigators created a chronological simulation of the assault. This reconstruction mapped the victim's movements, positioning, and reactions, as well as likely movements of the assailant. The combined analysis of hematoma placement, wound trajectory, and environmental context indicated that the victim had been cornered and assaulted in stages, moving to evade attacks, but ultimately overpowered. The simulation also illustrated how the fatal injury had occurred and the positioning of both individuals at that critical moment. The reconstruction was further enhanced with digital modeling and 3D visualization. By integrating photographic records, measurements, and spatial data, investigators could create a lifelike representation of the crime. Such models are invaluable in both investigative analysis and courtroom presentation, allowing juries and law enforcement to understand the physical dynamics of the incident in a clear and compelling manner. In this case, the model confirmed that the fatal injury was delivered with precision, consistent with deliberate intent rather than opportunistic violence. While physical and biological evidence painted a vivid picture, subtle psychological cues were also considered. Behavioral profiling provided insight into the likely characteristics and mindset of the assailant. Patterns of attack, choice of weapon, and the calculated sequence of actions suggested a methodical perpetrator with specific intent. The nature of the struggle and the avoidance of chaotic or random injuries indicated planning and situational awareness. By combining forensic evidence with behavioral analysis, investigators could not only reconstruct the actions of the crime, but also anticipate possible profiles of the suspect. The integration of environmental data contributed additional layers of context. Weather conditions, lighting, and the layout of the crime scene were analyzed to understand how these factors influenced the sequence of events. Rainfall, for instance, affected traction on certain surfaces, potentially contributing to the victim's inability to escape fully. Shadows and lighting patterns allowed investigators to determine visibility lines, confirming what the victim could or could not see during the assault. These subtle factors, though often overlooked, are essential for an accurate recreation of the crime. Meanwhile, meticulous examination of the victim's injuries revealed secondary trauma, further illuminating the narrative. Bruises on the back, abrasions on the hands, and contusions on the legs all indicated repeated contact, defensive actions, and attempts to evade attack. These secondary injuries were mapped against the primary fatal wound, revealing the likely order in which each injury occurred. By layering these observations, the forensic team could create a precise timeline of the struggle, turning the body into a chronological recorder of the attack. Forensic photography played a critical role throughout this phase. High-resolution images captured wounds, tissue damage, and microtraces in stunning detail. Specialized lighting techniques revealed patterns not visible to the naked eye, such as subtle abrasions, pressure marks, or residual materials embedded in the skin. Every photograph was carefully archived and cataloged, providing a permanent, unalterable record of the victim's condition. These images not only serve as evidence, but also aid in reconstructing the events in a visually coherent manner for investigators and legal proceedings. As the autopsy progressed, additional samples were collected for specialized testing, including ballistic residue, fibers, and chemical analysis of unknown residues found on the body or clothing. These tests often reveal connections that are not immediately obvious, such as contact with specific surfaces, weapons, or objects associated with the assailant. Each positive result, no matter how minor it seemed, contributed to the overarching narrative, transforming seemingly insignificant details into corroborated evidence of the crime. Throughout this phase, the autopsy report grew increasingly detailed and authoritative. Each observation, each sample, and each analytical result contributed to a clear and comprehensive understanding of the incident. The body itself served as the primary narrator, providing an objective record of the events that led to death. Unlike human witnesses, who may be influenced by memory lapses, fear, or bias, the victim's body retained an unaltered account, waiting to be interpreted by skilled forensic professionals. Once all internal examinations, toxicology, and trace analyses were complete, the forensic team synthesized the findings into a cohesive reconstruction of the murder. The report detailed the victim's last moments, the sequence of injuries, the physiological responses to trauma, and the probable position and actions of the assailant. Every stage of the assault was documented with precision, providing law enforcement with a reliable, scientifically grounded framework for identifying suspects, understanding motive, and corroborating other investigative leads. The synthesis of evidence culminated in a narrative that was both scientifically rigorous and dramatically compelling. It illustrated how the victim fought, how the assailant acted, and the series of critical moments that determined the outcome. The report also highlighted missed opportunities for intervention, situational dynamics that favored the perpetrator, and the subtle cues that forensic professionals could extract to solve the case. Ultimately, this phase demonstrated the power of forensic science to transform biological and environmental data into a definitive narrative. By combining toxicology, DNA, trace evidence, crime scene reconstruction, and behavioral analysis, the investigators could dismantle competing hypotheses and focus the case on the most probable sequence of events. The silent testimony of the body, interpreted with precision and expertise, became a cornerstone of justice, revealing not only the mechanics of death, but also the human story behind the crime. With the detailed autopsy completed and all toxicology, DNA, and trace evidence analyzed, the focus now shifted from laboratory science to the broader investigative and judicial process. The silent testimony of the victim's body, once recorded in painstaking detail, now became a central pillar supporting the larger narrative of the crime. Investigators synthesized each element: external injuries, internal trauma, defensive wounds, blood spatter, chemical analyses, and environmental context to produce a coherent reconstruction of events. Every data point aligned with a sequence of actions, offering a chronological roadmap from the first moment of contact to the fatal injury. The forensic team collaborated closely with homicide detectives to match the reconstructed events with physical evidence collected at the scene. Footprints, fingerprints, and fibers obtained from the victim and surrounding environment were cross-referenced against potential suspects. The foreign DNA discovered beneath the victim's fingernails became a critical lead, narrowing the investigation to a single individual whose prior criminal records and known associations matched the profile generated through behavioral analysis. The precise nature of the victim's injuries, coupled with the crime scene dynamics, painted a portrait of a methodical assailant who sought control, inflicted targeted trauma, and attempted to obscure the evidence of confrontation. Parallel to the investigative efforts, the autopsy report became a foundational document for legal proceedings. The defense and prosecution both relied heavily on its findings. In court, forensic experts presented detailed accounts of each injury, using visual documentation and 3D reconstructions to illustrate the sequence of events. The trajectory of wounds, timing of hemorrhaging, and pattern of defensive injuries were translated into a narrative accessible to jurors without sacrificing scientific precision. Each piece of evidence told a story. The victim's arms raised in instinctive defense, the angle of penetration indicating deliberate intent, and the minor abrasions marking struggle and resistance. Together, they provided a factual, impartial account that contradicted speculative claims or misinformation. The courtroom reconstruction drew upon both forensic science and environmental analysis. Lighting conditions, spatial dimensions, and movement patterns were presented using digital overlays, demonstrating how the assailant maneuvered to gain advantage and how the victim attempted to escape. The DNA evidence, carefully preserved and analyzed, linked the suspect definitively to the crime without ambiguity. Trace evidence, such as fibers from clothing and soil samples, corroborated the suspect's presence at the scene. By combining these elements, the prosecution constructed a compelling, evidence-based narrative that allowed jurors to visualize the crime as it unfolded in real time. Behavioral profiling also played a crucial role in the judicial phase. Expert testimony described the psychological profile of the perpetrator, inferred from both crime scene behavior and injury patterns. The deliberate targeting of vital areas, avoidance of unnecessary wounds, and controlled movements indicated a calculated mindset. This behavioral insight supported conclusions drawn from the autopsy and crime reconstruction, providing context that elevated the purely physical findings into an understanding of motive and intent. Psychological evidence helped jurors comprehend the nature of the threat, the level of planning, and the deliberate cruelty involved, reinforcing the scientific findings with human behavioral logic. Throughout the trial, visual aids derived from the autopsy report enhanced clarity and comprehension. High-resolution photographs of wounds, internal trauma, and defensive injuries were presented alongside digital models of the crime scene. These visuals emphasized the sequence of events, the dynamics of the struggle, and the correlation between evidence and action. Even subtle details like bruising patterns, trajectory angles, and fiber transfers became crucial for demonstrating the meticulous work behind the forensic conclusions. The jury was shown not only what occurred, but also how it was reconstructed, emphasizing the reliability of forensic science in determining the truth of violent events. In parallel, expert witnesses elaborated on the physiological aspects of the victim's injuries. For example, cardiac trauma resulting from the penetrating chest wound was explained in medical terms. The disruption of the heart muscle and the rapid onset of internal hemorrhage left little chance for survival. Hematomas on the arms and contusions on the torso were interpreted as clear signs of defensive action, establishing that the victim resisted the assault until the final moments. This medical insight translated the silent testimony of the body into an accessible story of the struggle, revealing the human cost behind the clinical findings. Environmental and situational analysis also contributed to understanding the dynamics of the attack. Investigators examined the location's layout, lighting conditions, and potential obstructions. These factors were critical for interpreting how the victim moved, how the assailant gained advantage, and why certain injuries occurred in specific locations. Forensic modeling demonstrated that even small shifts in position could determine the outcome, showing the interplay between environment, human behavior, and fatal consequences. This holistic approach, combining body, evidence, environment, and behavior, ensured that the narrative of the crime was both scientifically rigorous and humanly comprehensible. One significant aspect revealed in this final analysis was the role of timing and sequence. The precise order of injuries, correlated with internal hemorrhage patterns and defensive wounds, allowed investigators to determine that the victim's incapacitation occurred gradually rather than instantaneously. This sequence not only confirmed the assailant's methodical approach, but also highlighted the victim's efforts to survive. In many cases, understanding this timeline provides critical insight into opportunity, motive, and the nature of premeditation. In this instance, the reconstruction revealed a deliberate, calculated act of violence that unfolded over several critical minutes, turning an otherwise chaotic event into a discernible, traceable narrative. The integration of all forensic data also informed secondary investigations. Digital evidence, such as phone records and surveillance footage, was cross-referenced with physical findings, confirming suspect movements and establishing intent. Trace evidence from clothing and environmental sampling connected the assailant to the crime scene, while toxicology ruled out factors that might complicate the interpretation. Each investigative strand, when woven together, created an unbroken chain of evidence, leaving minimal room for doubt. Finally, the autopsy report and associated reconstructions provided closure beyond the courtroom. By translating the silent testimony of the body into a coherent narrative, investigators could convey the truth of the crime to the victim's family, law enforcement, and the public. While the images and descriptions were harrowing, they offered a definitive account that reconciled conflicting witness statements, speculation, and rumor. The precise reconstruction of the murder, grounded in scientific analysis, illuminated the realities of human behavior, the consequences of violence, and the power of meticulous forensic investigation. In conclusion, the final phase demonstrated that the body is both evidence and storyteller. Every wound, contusion, and internal trauma piece contributes to a comprehensive account of a violent act. Through autopsy, toxicology, trace analysis, and reconstruction, the silent testimony of the victim was transformed into undeniable truth. For investigators, it provided actionable intelligence. For prosecutors, it provided clarity and authority. For jurors, it offered insight. And for the victim's memory, it offered justice. The case exemplified how forensic science bridges the gap between tragedy and truth, ensuring that the story of the crime is not lost to speculation but preserved in the language of evidence, rigor, and methodical investigation. This final part underscores the essence of forensic investigation, The meticulous translation of biological, environmental, and behavioral data into an objective, irrefutable narrative of human action and consequence. It confirms that, even in death, the victim can speak, providing clarity where chaos once reigned, revealing the truth that only science, observation, and dedication can uncover.